Hello, hello. This is Derek from One River Tea. Welcome back to another episode of Tea Soup, a podcast all about tea culture, life in modern China, and Chinese tea. I'm your host, Derek Poskin. I've been living in China since 2016, and I've been drinking, buying, and selling Chinese tea for the past decade. So, pop on that kettle, heat up your teaware, and let's get this session started. Alright, so thunder is rumbling in the earth and the insects are awakening. And yes, that's right, we're finally at the very first flush of green tea harvest here in Zhejiang, Fujian, Anhui, and Jiangsu. And I finally started seeing a lot of my friends, the tea farmers that I buy from year after year, are starting to post on their WeChat feeds about the very first tasting of the teas, the very first harvest, the buds that are coming out of the leaves at this point in time. And what's really interesting about this is I've been seeing the 2023 harvest popping up on the Instagram feeds for almost a month now, since February, which, you know, as we mentioned last episode, gives me all kinds of red flags, because right now, really the only place that's growing and picking and processing teas is probably Sichuan. Maybe some early areas have some really early varietals that'll grow, but you also have to calculate the time it takes to ship the tea to the other side of the world as well. And so when I see 2023 February green teas, you know, in other nations, I'm very confused by this. But anyways, when I saw these on the Instagram last month, I messaged a lot of my makers in Hubei and Anhui, Hunan, Zhejiang, and Jiangsu, and the consensus was that the new tea wouldn't start until after March 6th. And if you remember from the last week's episode, we talked about all the different solar terms, and March 6th is the awakening of insects, the Jingzhe, and this really coincides with the first kind of harvest you can have for a lot of types of teas. So really briefly to introduce some of the teas from these different regions, what I've seen from Sichuan usually comes out of the Mengding area. I've seen the sparrow's tongue, the trisha, and then also the ganlu. I think it's, was that the sweet dew? Not to be confused with the Sweetest Dew. Shout out to Dylan. Speaking of, let's talk about some of the other green teas that I mentioned, the other regions that are now finally starting to pick. And one of them is the Sweetest Dew's favorite, Maofeng. The Maofeng, that comes from Anhui. Also in Anhui, you have the Taiping Ho Kui, the really, really large pressed leaf of greens. And you also have the Qimen black tea. I mentioned Hubei. In Western Hubei, it's famous for the Yulu, or the Jade Dew, which is often considered the ancestor of Gyokuro, which is also, it's kind of a direct translation of the two. I think Gyokuro is the same as Yulu. It's just a translation from Chinese to Japanese, and then we translate it into the Jade Dew. Sometimes we leave it untranslated. I'll talk about some of the translation issues we have with some of these tea names here in a bit. But so that's a steamed green tea that's really popular in Japan now. We also have in Hunan, it's very famous for a lot of herbal teas, this tong cha, this like vine tea, which is really cool. But recently they've started making a lot more of the green teas. Previously, they had a great contribution to the universe of the dark tea world known as the Anhua Hei Cha, and so they produce a lot of that. But now they're kind of getting into white teas and green teas and a bunch of other teas. And that's where we get the golden green from. That's from a small village in Hunan. Zhejiang is famous for its well-known production of the Dragon Well green tea, or the Longjing. And then Suzhou is a modern city, kind of a tech giant in this area of Jiangsu. They're famous for the production of Biluochun, which is the topic for today's episode. Now, I just named a lot of provinces making a lot of different types of teas. And what I want to do now is to give you a kind of a geographic refresher, looking at these regions and talking about the teas that they're making a little bit really quickly. And so starting from our old favorite province, Fujian, let's work our way a bit north and inland. So looking at the map, it's really easy to locate the large island of Taiwan off the coast. From Taiwan, you cross that strait and you hit the mainland. And here, if you're in the north, you will hit Fuzhou. If you're in the south, you'll hit Xiamen, which is previously called Amoy. And Fuzhou is the modern capital of Fujian, but Xiamen is a beautiful, beautiful rainy city. I had a friend who lived there, and she said it was just raining all the time. She couldn't stand it. But I've traveled there a few times, and it's a beautiful port city. Now, if you go directly north from here, from Fujian, you'll cross over into Zhejiang pretty quickly. And then if you stay inland away from the coast, you'll hit Hangzhou. Hangzhou is famous for its production of Longjing, or Dragon Well green tea. Now, speaking of Dragon Well green tea, I think we should back up a little bit. Now, as we were traveling north from Fujian into Zhejiang, to the provincial capital of Hangzhou, we passed by a really small county. It was called Xinchang. Xinchang is actually the place where a lot of the modern Dragon Well is grown and processed. And this is kind of in the Shaoxing jurisdiction, in the very far south of Shaoxing. So sometimes you'll see Shaoxing Dragon Well, but really most of it comes from this small county called Xinchang. Xinchang has just these beautiful mountain ranges, and it's very isolated from away from like larger cities. And so it is a really good place to make nice quality tea. I mean, I would prefer tea made in a very rural country area rather than tea made next to a huge city. Like literally, the Hangzhou Westlake area is just a couple kilometers from a huge bustling metropolis. So let's see. So now that we're at Xinchang, we're still several hundred kilometers from our destination of Suzhou, but only about 100 kilometers away from Hangzhou. So let's keep going north to Hangzhou. If we keep going north and a little bit west, what we'll do is we'll pass through the beautiful ancient canal city of Shaoxing. Shaoxing is absolutely gorgeous. It's the hometown of Lu Xun, who was a revolutionary author who helped instigate the 1919 May 4th revolution in the rubble of the Qing dynasty that was just recently overthrown. He wrote a lot of really incredible short stories, satirical fictions. Some of my favorites of his works are The Diary of a Madman and the very sad story of Kong Yiji. But without getting in too deep into his text, The Diary of a Madman is just fantastic. It's revolutionary not only in its content, but also in its unforgiving use of the Chinese vernacular, which previously had always been kind of looked down upon as the language of the common people and not the language of the scholars. And so a lot of the May 4th authors, Lu Xun is always often heralded as the father of modern Chinese literature, and he just gave the voice back to the people. So anyways, Shaoxing has a huge, beautiful history, and it's a really well-preserved old town. And this is usually in this region, that's where they're producing most of the Dragon Well that gets sold as Westlake Dragon Well because the Westlake is just too small. So now that you're in Shaoxing, you can actually just hop on the recently constructed metro and take that about 1 or 2 hours north, and you'll get into the late Song Dynasty capital of China, Hangzhou. On the Westlake of Hangzhou, its iconic Westlake, one of its shores hugs a very developed city center. The other side hugs the mountains where the Dragon Well green tea is grown. In this mountain range, which is rigidly controlled by the government, has regulations, reservations, all types of red tape to grow and pick and process tea in this area. This is what's the Westlake Dragon Well region. And within this region, there's a small village called Dragon Well. And there is indeed an actual well full of blue-green water, whose lichen-lined stones are even carved in likenesses of dragons. A really, really beautiful, ancient feeling of a well. And it has this weird property. I was there in 2017, and there's this thing that you could do where you take like a stick or a twig, and you spin it around, make a circle in the water, and it creates these oscillating halos that are really, really slow to fade. And the idea is like the water is just so mineral rich that this is one of its properties. But one interesting point about this is that this is not the best well for getting water to make tea. That's actually down by the Hupaochuan, or the Running Tiger Spring. This is the spring that's really, really famous for brewing Dragon Well green tea with its water. But anyways, more details on all this in the exclusive Dragon Well episode that I'll do later. I just wanted to give you this course of path, this course of direction, because I will be going down to Xinchang and Shaoxing in the next couple weeks to look at their knockoff Dragon Well and stuff like that. So this episode, what I really want to do is I want to show you Biluochun. And so we still have about 100 kilometers northeast we need to travel from Hangzhou towards that big, huge lake, the freshwater lake you can see from space, called Lake Tai. This is very close to Shanghai if you're looking on a map. And right on the east side of the lake, that's Suzhou. And then you can see very close to like the southeast edge of the lake, there's the mountain. That's the Shishandao, the West Lake Mountain. And then also jutting out into the lake at the bottom, the southeast side, you get the Dongting Peninsula. And these two areas are really, really famous for the origin of Biluochun. Now, Biluochun, unlike Dragonwell, unlike the Jade Dew, unlike a lot of other Chinese tea names, it doesn't get a nice translated moniker that could be used in the West. I've seen the really clunky translations of green snail spring, but it's really just like that's not the most attractive name for a really nice green tea, at least not in modern times. But what's really interesting about the Biluochun, though, is that the origin of the name is tightly tied up with the tea's general origin myths. And I say myths in the plural because there are about 3 different myths that I want to talk about for the origin of Biluochun. One of them is very much in the aqueous realm of prehistory of heroes and dragons. The second one is a little more plausible, but still takes kind of place before a lot of written history. And the third one is the most historically reliable, but still could be a little embellished here and there. So we'll get into them one by one. First, for those of you who really don't know what Biluochun is, it's this really, really lovely, beautiful, tender green tea that's rolled slightly into kind of curls. It's not tightly rolled balls like the Western gunpowder green tea. It's very loosely delicate curls that you can see the tea buds on it. It looks like it's covered in down, covered in hair. And when you brew it, all these trichomes get suspended in the water, and so it becomes really, really opaque. The tea itself is really sweet. Really, the smell, the fragrances, the aromas are very citrusy, a little fruity, but the taste in itself is a lot more savory notes, a little more umami. And so this tea from this region, and we'll talk about that later, why it's so peculiar for this region, has just been around since the Tang Dynasty, supposedly. So let's get into the origin myths from the ancient times all the way up into the present. So the first one is all about the Biluo. This is a girl. She's a singing girl who lived in the mountains in prehistory. And so obviously Biluochun is like her name, and then Chun is spring. And so this myth claims that it's named after a hero from pre-modern times. So the story goes like this. Once upon a time, long, long ago, there lived a girl named Biluo on the Xishan mountain in the middle of Lake Tai. And there was another young man named Xiang who lived on the Dongting Peninsula. And these two fell deeply, deeply in love. And one year, a very brutal dragon appeared in Lake Tai and threatened to take Biluo away. And so what Xiang had to do is Xiang had to sail to the island and fight with the dragon. In the myth, supposedly he fought for 7 days and 7 nights and couldn't quite vanquish the dragon, and yet the dragon also couldn't quite vanquish Xiang, and eventually Xiang fainted and the dragon fled. And the beauty of the story, Biluo, who these two were fighting over, finds Xiang in the pool of blood, and she takes him home and starts administering to his wounds and everything, trying to find as much medicines as she can to help heal him, because he essentially rescued her from the dragon. And so she's trying all of these different medicines, but his state is just weakening and weakening and weakening. Then one day when she's out gathering herbs, she comes across the place where she first found Xiang, in that pool of blood after fighting the dragon. And in that area, there was this really fragrant small bush. And she thought, wow, this is such a beautiful plant that arose in response to, his blood in the battle. And so what she did is she cultivated it, took good care of it, and then transplanted it all the way over to the Dongting Peninsula. From the Xishan Island to the Dongting Peninsula, which is where Xiang is from. And Xiang's health was still not going very well until spring hits. This is right around the Qingming festival. And Biluo gets a sudden vision of the tea plants that she had planted. And so she runs up the mountain, but she's too eager. She doesn't have a basket. So she picks all the fresh buds and holds them very close to her chest. And as she's running down, she can smell their fragrances start emanating. And so she brews them up as tonic for Xiang, and he's immediately refreshed. Now, a few cool things that this myth does is it sanctifies Xishandao, the island in the middle of Lake Tai, as the mythic birthplace for the wild Biluochun heirloom. But then it also talks about how it got over to the Dongting Peninsula. And it does this all through the story of love and a righteous battle and the evil dragon. A really, really wonderful little story there. Another thing it also does is it talks about the fragrance that comes when picking and withering this tea, and that's something that comes into the next story about the origin of Biluochun. And this is actually a story about the origin of what it used to be before it was renamed Biluochun. It used to be scared to death fragrance. This is the Xiaxia fragrance, and this is a very interesting name. And so the second origin myth kind of talks about how this name came to be, and then how that name was eventually changed into Biluochun. And this one is a little more plausible, more so than the first one, just because it doesn't have dragons in it, and it actually does have some goblins. So let's get into it. So this takes place at the base of the Dongting Peninsula and the Dongting Mountain. And one day, one spring day, there's this really strange fragrance that's coming off of the mountains. They say it's by the Moli Feng, like the jasmine peak of the mountain. And everyone's terrified. They're like, we've never smelled this before. It's got to be goblins. And so they think it's spirits or monsters up on this mountain doing something to create these really strange fragrance. But there's this woodcutter girl who's unafraid. And so she's like, you know what? It's just a smell, guys. It's not really that scary. And so she goes up into the mountains to collect some firewood. And as she's doing it, she comes across that beautiful, intoxicating smell. She follows it to a few wild tea bushes. And she's like, this is the plant that's creating that wonderful fragrance. And so she just has her woodcutter's axe and stuff like that, but she picks some of the fresh, tender shoots of it and is going to bring them back down and see if, there's any medicine, show the villagers, oh, there's nothing to be scared of. So she's picking them, holding them to her chest, and as she's walking down the mountains, they start getting a little warm. They start oxidizing slightly and withering, and they exude more and more of that fragrance. So she starts getting even more scared. And so she's like shouting on the way down the mountain as the fragrance is overcoming her. And she gets into the village, she gets into her house, and she's like, everyone in the house is shouting, like, the fragrance is here. And she throws it into a pot of hot water and drinks it and just realizes, like, the really, really beneficial effects of it. Supposedly, she was so excited about it that she found these tea bushes again, retransplanted them all over the Dongting Mountains, and brought them to the Xishandao. And this is really fascinating because in the other story, the other origin myth, the wild tea trees were found on the island in the middle of the lake. In this story, it's found on the Dongting Peninsula. And in both the stories, they're brought over to the other area. And so there are two main production areas of the Biluochun, and both are kind of vying for the origin of Biluochun, the origin of the wild bushes. And so it's interesting to see like which kind of story you adhere to, if you believe it is actually from the island or if it's from the peninsula. Oh, sorry guys, I have to take a little bit of a tea break here. I don't know if you can tell, but I have a little bit of a head cold, stuffy nose, my lungs don't feel too well. Here in China, a lot of times what happens is the pollution sometimes gets pretty bad. I'm living in Jiangsu, kind of in between Nanjing and Shanghai, in a city called Yangzhou. And usually we'll have, maybe 2 weeks, 20 days of pretty bad air pollution. And when I say bad air pollution, I mean like 150 parts per million, up to like, I've seen it as bad as 400. But personally, and this is just a kind of discussion of life in modern China, it seems pretty common in the central areas in the north. When I was down in Chaozhou, I didn't get a bad air days a whole lot, just because the mitigating factor of the ocean and stuff like that. But here in central China, northern China, eastern China, you get a little more of these bad air days. And this is when I look out the window and the buildings in the distance are a little hazy. I open the window and it smells. It's hard to really explain if you've never lived in a place with bad air pollution. It's kind of hard to explain what exactly the smell is, but it's very distinct. It kind of smells like a slightly burnt scents, and it's I don't know, kind of pretty dusty. It feels like as well. And usually when the air pollution gets over 100, I can feel it. And so like 4 days ago, it got over 100, and it stayed at like 150, got near to 200 for a few days, and then I immediately started getting, symptoms of having a cold and stuff like that. So sorry if my voice is a little, a little nasally, a little weird this episode, but it is what it is. But fortunately, there's always tea. And so what I'm brewing right now is some of the aged white peony. We just released some of this 2015 white peony, and it's beautiful. Whenever I have a cold like this, I always drink aged white tea. Yesterday I was drinking some of the old Shomei, the 2013 Shomei tea cake, and I have some 15-year-old orange peel, like the Chinese chen pea, and I added that to it, and I was just the best thing for my cold. So I wonder if you have any teas that you kind of drink for your colds when you're feeling sick, for the sore throat and stuff like that. Give me a shout, let me know, because for me, aged white tea is the end all be all. But I'd be curious to see what somebody else thinks. I've had friends who've said when they have a head cold, like a really nasally head cold, they drink really fragrant dancong oolongs, and that kind of wakes up the senses, penetrates the sinuses and stuff. So yeah, if you have any suggestions, just give me a shout on Instagram, send me an email, admin@onerivertea.com. But yeah, let's get back to the story. Actually, let me drink a little more tea. All right. Okay, so we covered two of the more legendary accounts of the origin of Biluochun. One originating in the island, the Shishandao, a battle with the dragon, with A Xiang and Biluo, the singing girl. The other one on Dongting Mountain, with the goblins making all this weird fragrances, and the woodcutter girl going up there and discovering the plants. And now let's look at the actual historical records, the primary source material, and see if any of this checks out. So looking as far back as we can to tea production in this region, the region is first known for making tea. It's recorded in a Tang Dynasty ledger about tribute teas. And supposedly the Dongting Peninsula, I believe it was just called Dongting tea, Dongting cha, was one of the tribute teas. And so here, as we know from episode 1, a lot of these famous teas were just called based on their regions, and they didn't have these special names quite yet. And so this definitely checks out. Digging deeper, we see that there are several different types of tea that are grown in this area and by the Leaning Tiger Hill, the Tiger Pagoda, which is a really cool pagoda. It's actually kind of like China's Leaning Tower of Pisa, where it's kind of tilted. It was an old stone pagoda built in, I believe, the 1300s. Okay, so this Leaning Tower of China in Suzhou on Tiger Hill was built around the 900s AD, and then about 700 years later they added on to it, where it's just like they built it 4 or 5 stories tall, and then the Ming Dynasty they added a few more layers to it, and I think that's probably what made it start tilting. But it's a really interesting place. But anyways, in that region there's historical evidence of tea being produced. There's tea being produced in the Dongting Mountains, that peninsula as well, but still the Biluochun name hasn't arisen yet. And so digging deeper into the primary source materials, I was looking at one of our favorite tea encyclopedias by Zhuang Wuzang, written in 1979. It's the Introduction to Chinese Teas. One thing we really like about this book and this author is there's not a whole lot of romanticization going on about the origins of the tea. Everything is pretty scientific, pretty deadpan in the way they're explaining the origin of these teas and what they're kind of doing for the people and populace. It has a little bit of red flair to it, where it's very much, from the people, for the people, empowerment and stuff like that. But what we see here is there's not this Biluochun is the most ancient tea ever created. It's a very reasonable way that's this guy's taking to look at the origin of the tea. And so he actually quotes this calligrapher from the Ming Dynasty who references a Biluo Ridge on Dongting Mountain, or the West Lake Mountain. It's kind of both of these, both the West Lake Mountain and the Dongting Peninsula both have a Biluo Ridge. And this Biluo Ridge was mentioned in Yuan or Ming Dynasty calligrapher named Wang Chong. And Ming Dynasty was around 1500s, right? And so he talked about this ridge in his mountain travel series. And one compelling point about this ridge being, in fact, part of the origin of the name is the fact that during the Ming Dynasty, it still wasn't called Biluochun. It was called Scared to Death Fragrance. So we see that in both of these places renowned for the origin of Biluochun, there is a Biluo Ridge that predates the Biluochun name. And so there's a good reason that that name might be taken for the tea. But again, at this time, it was still called the Scared to Death Fragrance. And while there are many stories about how this Scared to Death Fragrance name was created, sometimes it's not a woodcutter girl, sometimes it's a nun, sometimes it's the whole villagers, the essence of the story is the same. They smell a great fragrance from the mountain, they go up and they start picking the teas. They have too much, they can't put it in the baskets, and so they hold them to their chest, they hold them in their clothes, the tea gets warm, wilts, withers, and then starts exuding this really amazing fragrance. And so that story is kind of consistent throughout the historical records and through the mythologies and whatnot. And so that might have a good reason for it being called the Scared to Death Fragrance. But when does the Scared to Death Fragrance change into Biluochun? Historically, this change is credited to the early Qing Dynasty Emperor Kangxi. And he took a few southern tours of China, and he visited so many places. He was a very capable ruler. A lot of China really, really respects him for what he did for the early Qing Dynasty. And he went to Lake Taihu, whereupon the local governor presented him this Scared to Death fragrance tea. And Kangxi loved it, but thought that the name was just kind of low, like didn't really do the tea honor. And so supposedly he is the one who renamed the tea Biluochun. And while there might not be 100% truth in this story, it kind of gives us these specific, or relatively specific dates. So the name probably changed to Biluochun in the Qing Dynasty, in the early Qing Dynasty. Before that, in the Ming Dynasty, it was probably called the Scared to Death Fragrance, where in the Tong, we see just the Dongting tea. And so we see these few different origins going through the dynasties. Though the story of the emperor renaming the tea from Scared to Death Fragrance, which is a pretty cool name in my opinion, to something like Biluochun, which is a little more elegant in the Chinese, really reflects what happens with us. A lot of the hidden work behind buying, sourcing, and selling Chinese teas, especially through different cultures with different languages, it's the name issue. And so similar to the Emperor Kangxi, we run into several problems with Chinese tea names. Biluochun sounds lovely in Chinese, but it really doesn't translate to English. I mentioned earlier some people call it green snail spring, which just doesn't sound like a good tea. But also digging deeper into the historical record of this name, Biluo could be the name of a ridge. Biluo could be the name of a girl. And so for proper nouns, you don't really want to translate them. You want to keep them the same. You know, like Ensher Yulu. No one ever translates Ensher, because that's the name of the city, but they'll translate Lu Yu as Jedu. And so they'll say Ensher Jedu instead of Ensher Yulu. But at the same time, for a lot of Westerners, Ensher Jedu is still half unintelligible. A lot of people don't know what Ensher is. And so to name it after the girl Biluo and call it Biluo Spring, because Chun you can translate to spring, and instead of calling it Biluochun, you call it Biluo Spring, still mostly it's unintelligible. People might not understand what it is. And this is just a really kind of haunting problem for us selling these teas, and one that I go back and forth on all the time. You know, Alex and I are pretty good with Chinese, and so for us, we just use the pinyin between us and the Chinese between us when we're talking about it. But when we're selling it to the West, sometimes we'll translate names. Sometimes we'll only use the pinyin. This is the transliteration instead of the actual translating. And sometimes we'll even just give it new names, rename it, because certain names are really just a little unintelligible. And one that I'm thinking about right now that a lot of people have liked that I probably should have just named is the Meiho Wang. Meiho Wang is essentially the Monkey King. And so it could be like the Monkey King Oolong, but instead we've just called it Mei Ho Wang the entire time. And I'm sure that no one in the West has gotten the Mei Ho Wang and thought, oh, the Monkey King. Wow. But for us, it's like, it's just part of the name. Like, that is the name. It just means Monkey King. So that's one example of a tea that we probably should have translated. But a few other ones that I always go back and forth on are the white teas, particularly the Baimudan. So Baimudan is the white peony. But for me, I have always just used Baimudan. Baimudan, the Mudan Wang, the Mudan Jiping. These are all, for me, very, very easy to see, like, oh, that is the tea. And when I say white peony, I feel like I'm distancing myself from what the tea actually is. Another one that's really difficult is the Shomei. Shomei has never been translated into the West because it just doesn't really, it's like Biluochun, it's like green snail spring. It doesn't sound good. I've seen it clunkily translated as longevity eyebrows. That's Shomei. And what's amazing is it actually fits. Like, that's actually a good translation of the name. And so the name in itself in Chinese is a little awkward. And so it's composed of the two characters Shou and Mei. Shou is a really cool Chinese character that kind of means longevity, but also contains the idea of life and death and the whole interconnected round of creation, destruction, being, and non-being. I saw a really amazing shrine to this character, to Shou, in the Guoqing Temple over the national holiday just a few months ago, and it was beautiful. It was like this small little corner in like a larger shrine hall, and they had this beautiful calligraphic representation of the character, the Shou character. And there was an altar, they had fruit, they had candles, and I could just see how much honor was being placed in this idea of longevity, of life and death, of understanding the human's place in the cosmos. So this character is really beautiful, the Shou. And then next to it, we get Mei, which just means eyebrows. And so it's just like, it's this really complex character plus eyebrows. And it's just a really strange name. But one really interesting thing, and this will take me back into the temples of Guoqing Temple and other temples around, they have the Hall of the Arhats, which is, like 99 sages and like bodhisattvas and people that have really mastered the Buddhist sutras. And every now and then you get one with just hugely bushy eyebrows, like absurdly bushy, like 3 inches coming out of their forehead. And I always thought, like, oh yeah, this is just like a representation, because you go into the Hall of Arhats and all of the sages are carved differently, and these are like life-size statues. It's really cool. If you've ever been to a Chinese temple, a Buddhist temple with these Hall of Arhats, it's really quite something, because they're usually on pedestals surrounded by you. You're surrounded by them. In the Guoqing Temple, they're all gold, and you kind of walk through this library of huge statues with all their marvelous different features, their different quirks and stuff like that, some with these huge bushy eyebrows. And I thought it was always just an affectation they put on these Arhats until, I think it was 2017. I was walking around the Westlake area in Longjing right before Qingmingjie. This is like when I was just scouting it out for the very first time. And in the early morning, I ran across somebody else who was also taking a walk, and he was an old man with white hair, and he had these enormous bushy eyebrows. They were beautiful. They were white and fluffy and protruded a good 2 inches from his forehead. They looked like little wings right above his eyes. And I swear, he must have combed them every morning and just taken really good care of them, because they were fantastic. They were magnificent. And my first thought was like, oh my gosh, it's an Arhat. You meet the Buddha on the road. And I just said good morning, and he said good morning. And we just kept walking. Now that I'm thinking about it, he did actually point me in the right direction to the running tiger spring. So that was nice of him. But anyways, longevity eyebrows. So that's the clunky translation for Shomei. Biluochun's clunky translation is green snail spring. Let me see, what other weird ones are there? Oh, there are some really strange Dansong Oolong names. It's really, really fascinating. Because I talked to Sohan from West China Tea about this. We had an Instagram live a little while ago, last year sometime. And we talk about the crazy Dansong Oolong names and our difficult time translating them. And I reached out to Sohan because I had This tea that I've been selling, Lei Kou Chai. And I was like, man, I really like this tea. I really want to sell it. But Lei Kou Chai to everyone doesn't mean anything. Even to Chinese people, they don't get it. It doesn't quite make sense. Sometimes the dance song names are also in the dialect, but this is just three random words. It means thunder, bundle, firewood. And so it's like Zeus spears or something like that. I was trying to think of like ways to phrase this. I'm like Zeus's lightning bolt tea. And I'm like, no, that's appropriation. That's putting somebody else's culture on somebody else's culture. And so I come up with the idea thunderstruck. And then I realize that I've seen thunderstruck before, and I realize the West China tea has been labeling their teas as thunderstruck. So I reach out to Sohan because we kind of arrived at the same translation for this name. And I wanted to talk to him about how to translate these names, because sometimes they're really difficult. So if you're interested in that, this Instagram live should still be up. And it was a really fascinating thing where we talk all about, the delicate process of taking a tea from one culture with its own unique name that fits its culture, and then marketing it, bring it into another culture, and seeing what you can preserve of the cultural integrity, what can be changed tastefully, and just generally being mindful when you're translating these things not to change it too far from its original source. So, like I said, we have Shoumei, we have Gongmei. Gongmei, as I mentioned earlier, is the imperial eyebrows. And so it only makes sense if you know about Shoumei. Then Gongmei makes sense, because Shoumei is longevity eyebrows, Gongmei is tribute eyebrows. But if you just call a tea tribute eyebrows, I don't think a lot of people are going to be interested in buying that tea. However, you see this working really well for some of their other teas like duck shit oolong, the yashishang. People love that. In China, people love it. I've seen it everywhere here, get really picking up in popularity. When I first got here, no one drank any dan song. No one knew what it was. Maybe they knew Milan Shang, but then after a few years, duck shit oolong started really popping off. People started drinking it a whole lot, and I see it in milk tea stores. I see it in like hip restaurants and stuff like that. Always pre-bottled though, never like brewed fresh or gong fu. But anyways, I'll probably come back to this discussion on the naming conventions of Chinese teas later, because it's always something we have to consider. It's always part of the hidden work that goes into sourcing these teas. Let's get back to Biluochun. So, Biluochun is always just Biluochun, very, very rarely translated. And we see it has these three main myths. One is with the singing girl Biluo and Ah Xiang, who fall in love. Dragon comes, tries to steal her. Ah Xiang defeats him, bleeds, and from his blood grows the first Biluochun bush. The second story, the Dongting mountain begins to exude strange fragrances. Everyone's terrified. One brave woodcutter girl goes up and discovers the tea. Upon bringing it down, it begins to exude this strange fragrance, and it scares her even more, but then she drinks it as a tea. The third, slightly more historical story is the fact that they gave this tea to the early Qing dynasty Emperor Kangxi, and he loved it but thought the scared to death fragrance was just a bad name, and so he renamed it Biluochun. Now, I mentioned earlier what it kind of looks like. It's a slightly tender leaves, small, slender leaves that are slightly curled, not quite rolled into a ball, but you can see the curls. They interlock with each other like Velcro, and they're just covered in this down, these trichome-laden buds and everything. And I've seen the processing. The processing's really fascinating. I'm going to talk about that more in the next episode, because I will just do the whole my experience on the island, how I met the people, the processing and whatnot. But Biluochun, like Dragonwell, is a tea that's entirely made in a wok. So if you go back to episode 6, I talk about the idea of Shaoxing, and how I really finally realized that Shaoxing is just any tea that's made in a wok. That's the frying process, the kill green process, the shaping, the rolling, the drying. It all happens in a wok. So this is a Shaoxing tea. Another interesting idea about this tea is the brewing method. What usually happens with the Biluochun is you have a glass of water, maybe like 80 degrees water, Celsius, and you take a handful of the tea and you drop it in. And supposedly, if it's really good Biluochun, it should settle immediately. It should have that earth. And so sometimes when you're judging teas like this, if you're brewing it grandpa style, the green teas have air and they have earth, they have qi, they have di. And depending on the different types of tea, you want a different ratio of the tea that settles to the bottom and the tea that stays at the top. Good Biluochun should always settle immediately at the bottom of the glass and then slowly begin to unfurl and open up. And from that opening up, you can see the clouds of trichomes and the oils from the tea seeping into the water. I love brewing tea like this and then holding my glass up to the sun. I'll do this outside everywhere, and I'm sure I look crazy because I'll take off my glasses and I'll put it really close to my face and just look at the oils coming off of the tea leaves in the water. But it's a beautiful thing. Another thing about this tea is its citrus notes. It should have this nice like fruity taste to it, fruity smell to it, and have like, for me, I always get like citrusy like lemons and oranges, orange zest from the aroma of it. And then the taste itself should be really, really rich and umami, really thick. For me, Biluochun was a tea that took a little time to grow on me. When I first liked the Chinese green teas, I was really into the Dragon Well, really into some of these stronger green teas. Biluochun has its strength, but it also has its tender sides, where if you brew it lightly, it can be a really sweet, delicate tea, but also it depends on how it's made. Like our producer makes it in a wok that's being wood-fired. A lot of producers nowadays make it in electric-fired woks or gas-fired woks, and that's easier to control the temperature, but you kind of lose that mastery, that sense of mastery. But anyways, we'll talk about that more in the next episode. Another really cool thing about the Xishan Dao versus the Dongting Shan is that usually the Dongting Shan, the Dongting Peninsula, is the origin, locally known as the original place for the Biluochun, but a lot of people in Suzhou always recommended me to go to the island, to the Xishandao Island, because that's where they're growing most of the Biluochun nowadays. And talking to Chen's been there for the past 60 years, living on that island and making Biluochun, and so it's also not a new thing. It's been around for quite some time. Also, the island is really famous for its production of fruit. And so the major agricultural products there are tea and fruit. They do so much liquat. This is the peepah. I saw persimmons. I saw peach trees, some citrus trees. They do some bayberries, pomegranates, and a whole lot of dates. I saw a lot of like the red dates stuff being grown there. And Old Master Chen was saying that the soil here is really good because of the profusion of fruit trees. Supposedly, and this is very, very, very hypothetical, the fruit trees give the tea the fruity flavor. And so because they're grown in such close proximity, there's communication between the roots and stuff like that. It's in all of the old texts that you want to grow your tea near the fruit trees, especially for this region. But I don't know which came first, right? Because the soil here is slightly acidic. A lot of other tea varietals don't do well in this soil, and Chen has experimented and stuff. And the other tea varietals cultivars don't grow well in this very acidic soil. And so what does grow well? The fruit trees and then this Biluochun local cultivated type of tea. All in all, I really think the Xishandao, the island in this lake, is really special for its production of tea, because the lake itself is really special. Xi, one of the four main beauties of Chinese history, who's also the namesake of the Xi teapot, supposedly ran away with her lover Fan Li into this lake, and they lived in these caves by Yixing. I think you can still find these caves, but this is after she had essentially enacted the fall of the Wu state by infiltrating, seducing the King Fujian and weakening the state drastically. It was all back in 500 BC, so this lake has a whole lot of history. And then also from this lake come these really beautiful weather-worn stones. They look like clouds, and you'll see this in a lot of like Chinese art museums and a lot of Chinese gardens. These really interesting boulders that are just totally eroded through, and they have holes that go right through them, and they have just this beautiful shape. A lot of those stones actually come from Lake Tai. And so this lake has a huge history in ancient China and a very artistic history as well. And so the fact that a really famous, wonderful tea is coming from it, I'm not surprised as well. So thanks for catching this episode about the history of Biluochun. In the next episode, I'm going to talk about Old Master Chen. I'm going to talk about how to get to the island. I'm going to talk about how I found them. I'm going to talk about production, what makes a good Biluochun versus a bad Biluochun, and then also the different styles of production and whatnot. So, again, this is Derek from One River Tea. Thanks for catching this episode. And until next time, brew happy.